Imagine loving someone deeply, believing that the life you've built together is unbreakable. That was my marriage, a partnership I thought would withstand anything. But then, out of nowhere, an old college admirer came back into my wife's life, setting off a chain of events that shattered my world. In a single night, the security, trust, and satisfaction I'd felt for decades began to unravel. This is a story of betrayal, resilience, and the painful journey of finding oneself again after a devastating loss. Sometimes, love isn't enough, but what we learn through heartbreak can change us forever. Join me as I share how one moment changed everything and forced me to rebuild, one piece at a time. I always thought Lucy and I had something solid, unshakable even. We'd been married for 26 years, and our story was filled with twists, the kind that brings a couple closer. From our college days, we'd faced ups and downs. Those long months apart when work or life took us in different directions. Maybe it was the distance that brought this deep sense of satisfaction, a mutual respect that seemed to last. But sometimes, in quiet moments, I'd wonder if all that stability was real or if, deep down, there was an intention or restlessness hidden beneath it. Each struggle we shared felt like another bond, a link that no one else could understand. I remember those early years, juggling new careers and big dreams that often pulled us to different cities. Weeks would pass with only a few late-night calls to hold us together. The memory still feels so vivid, the feeling of waiting, of missing her. And yet, each of those challenges brought us a kind of satisfaction. At that time, I was convinced nothing could weaken the connection we'd built. Not time, not distance. It seemed permanent, something I never questioned. When we finally married, it felt like the end of all those long years of uncertainty. I gave myself fully, trusting that time and loyalty would be enough to safeguard us. I saw us as a team, our intentions perfectly aligned, building a life that nothing could tear down. Each little victory, each hurdle, only deepened the promise we'd made to each other. But deep down, there was always an odd feeling, something that told me maybe I shouldn't be so sure, so secure. I pushed it aside, chalking it up to natural doubts. Now though, looking back, I can't help but wonder if I'd missed signs, if I'd been blinded by my own faith in us. All those years, all that history, but did I truly know her? It's a haunting thought, one that I kept hidden in the back of my mind, trusting in the stability we'd built. Ironically, that trust may have kept me from seeing what was right in front of me. The college reunion came up unexpectedly, but Lucy and I decided to go. It sounded fun, a way to reconnect and step out of our routine. Walking into the hall was like opening a time capsule. Familiar faces, old friends, even a few people I'd nearly forgotten. We laughed and swapped stories, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction seeing where life had taken everyone. But there was this tension too, a strange intention in the air, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Then I saw him. Rick, Lucy's old college friend. One she'd never really talked about, come to think of it. At first, I brushed it off as nothing. People get curious, ask questions. But Rick seemed more than a little curious, almost fixated. Every chance he got, he'd find a way to pull Lucy aside, his laughter a little too loud, his gaze a little too steady. I told myself it was just nostalgia, a spark of the old college days, but something didn't feel right. I'd catch Lucy glancing my way with this odd look, half smiling, half tense. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I felt the edge of discomfort creeping in, like something wasn't as innocent as it seemed. As the night wore on, Rick's presence became harder to ignore. He wasn't just reconnecting. He was lingering, waiting for moments to stand closer, talk quieter. Lucy seemed polite, but there was an uneasiness to her I couldn't ignore. I watched them from across the room, feeling this strange mix of curiosity and frustration. Had she always been this way around him? She'd never mentioned him much before, but now it felt like they shared some inside joke, some secret that went beyond casual conversation. It left a bitter taste, an intention I couldn't shake. By the end of the night, I felt drained, like the joy of seeing old friends had been overshadowed by Rick's strange fascination with Lucy. She brushed it off on the way home, but I couldn't. There was something off, something that lingered long after the reunion was over. I told myself I was overthinking, that I trusted her completely. But still, that nagging feeling stayed like a warning I couldn't ignore. After that night, Rick's behavior lingered in my mind, unsettling like a stone in my shoe. Lucy had brushed it off as nostalgia. Just an old friend catching up, she'd said. But I couldn't shake the feeling that his attention had a purpose, a subtle intention I wasn't comfortable with. A couple of days later, he messaged her. Nothing much, just a quick hello, some joke about the good old days. But it wasn't just once. Soon, their exchanges were popping up more often, like he'd been waiting years for an excuse to reconnect. At first, I convinced myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting. But the messages kept coming, the laughter she shared with him growing more familiar. It started to gnaw at me. Why was he so interested now? Why so eager? I couldn't tell if he was testing boundaries or just reminiscing. But with each message, it felt like he was crossing an invisible line, edging closer to something I couldn't quite name. I tried to ignore it, to focus on my work, but that strange sense of satisfaction he seemed to get from talking to her wouldn't leave me alone. Then there were the little things she didn't tell me, the comments he made that she only half laughed off, the subtle compliments he'd slip in. Every time I asked, she'd brush it aside, calling it nothing. I trusted her. We had 26 years of history behind us, after all. But this was different, a kind of attention that didn't feel respectful. I began to wonder if his intentions were purely friendly, or if something more was brewing beneath the surface. Lucy swore it was harmless, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was trying to reclaim a piece of her, as if their past meant more to him than just memories. As days went by, I felt the tension grow, a dark cloud hovering over something we hadn't named yet. I wanted to trust her, to believe it was just a phase, but I couldn't ignore the quiet way she'd smile after their exchanges, or the way she'd hesitate before telling me about him. Rick's presence was like an itch I couldn't scratch, and I started to wonder just how far he was willing to go, or if Lucy even realized how close he was already. The truth hit me like a cold wave, an unwelcome clarity I hadn't asked for. Late one night, Lucy sat me down with a look I'd never seen before, serious, almost apologetic. She confessed everything. She and Rick had shared more than just memories at the reunion. They'd crossed lines that night I thought we'd never approach. I listened numb as she explained, her words both raw and careful, as if she'd rehearsed each one. My heart twisted, an aching contradiction of betrayal and disbelief. Was this real? Had all those years, our life together, really come to this? She tried to explain it away, saying it was a moment of weakness, a lapse in judgment. But each word only made it worse, deepening the shock, the sting of her actions. I searched for some hint of intention, some hidden reason, but nothing could justify the weight of what she'd done. Every detail she shared felt like a cut, leaving me breathless. I wanted to believe this was all a bad dream, something we'd wake up from. But the satisfaction I'd once felt in our marriage now felt distant, like something that belonged to someone else. Questions buzzed through my mind, each one more painful than the last. Was it something I'd done or not done? How had I missed the signs? My thoughts were a tangled mess of self-doubt and anger. Yet beneath it all, I still felt love for her, a foolish loyalty I couldn't just switch off. It hurt to know that she'd let Rick, of all people, breach that sacred space between us. The memory of him laughing at that reunion, his glances, now felt like taunts, clues I hadn't noticed until it was too late. Part of me was furious. Part of me was just empty. As she reached out, I found myself pulling away, unable to bridge the distance that had suddenly appeared between us. She looked at me with pleading eyes, but I couldn't find any words of comfort, no way to make sense of what she'd done. That night left a scar, a question hanging in the air that we both feared to answer. Could we come back from this? I didn't know, but I couldn't ignore the fracture that now marked our once strong bond. And deep down, I wondered if Rick had been waiting all along for a moment just like this. Telling the kids felt like tearing open a wound I hadn't even begun to understand. They deserved to know, but I dreaded the hurt in their eyes. When I finally told them, their faces showed the shock and confusion I had anticipated, each of them processing the news in their own way. My oldest tried to mask his pain, keeping his expression as blank as possible, while my youngest looked like the ground had just dropped out from beneath her. They had always seen our marriage as a source of stability, a pillar that wouldn't shake. Now, that foundation had cracked, and the effect was devastating. They struggled to wrap their heads around it. How could this happen? Why? Questions came at me like waves, each one more piercing than the last. I tried to explain, to tell them that sometimes life isn't as clear as we want it to be. But it was impossible to ease their pain or answer the questions that still haunted me. I felt a mix of frustration and guilt, knowing they would carry the scars of this discovery, a weight that no one deserved. Watching their disappointment was like reliving the betrayal all over again. The hurt reflected back at me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Conversations around the house grew tense and awkward, a subtle but painful reminder of how fragile everything had become. I could see it in their eyes, the way they looked at Lucy, their mother, almost questioning everything they'd known about her. They struggled to reconcile the loving mother they'd always known with the decisions she'd made. And every time they hesitated, every time they turned away from her, I felt the ripples of her actions spreading, affecting the ones who had nothing to do with it. The family dinners, the laughter we once shared, seemed to fade into the background, replaced by an unspoken tension. In the days that followed, I noticed Lucy withdrawing, her shoulders heavy with regret, but unable to find the words that might bridge the gap. The pain lingered, a constant presence in our home, affecting each of us in ways we couldn't express. I knew this would leave a mark on us all, changing the dynamic of our family forever. The question of healing hung in the air, uncertain, as we all struggled to make sense of the damage left behind. It felt like our home had become a fragile shell, holding memories we didn't quite know what to do with anymore. After everything, I knew I couldn't keep living with this weight pressing on my chest. The decision to divorce wasn't easy, but it felt like the only way to find some peace of mind again. Sitting across from Lucy as we discussed what came next, there was this quiet finality to it. I could see the pain in her eyes, the regret etched into every line of her face. We'd spent years building a life together, but now it felt like a formality, a closing chapter neither of us could avoid. It was devastating, but there was also a strange sense of satisfaction, like taking control over something that had spiraled out of my hands. Each step in the process felt surreal. Papers, lawyers, meetings, it was all so clinical, so far from the life we'd shared. I never imagined that things would end up this way. I caught myself remembering little things as we divided our belongings. Photos, books, shared dreams that now seemed like relics of a different time. I could tell she wanted to say something, maybe to ask for another chance. But the intention was clear, written in the quiet between us, that we were past any words that might fix what had been broken. The hurt was too deep, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. With each passing day, I felt a strange relief mixed with sadness. There were moments I missed her, a part of me hoping that maybe I was wrong, that we could turn back time. But the damage was real, the trust shattered. Staying together would mean constantly revisiting that night, questioning everything. And I knew I couldn't live with that shadow hanging over me. As much as it hurt, I needed to let go, for my own sanity and for the sake of whatever future I might have. The divorce process became not just an end, but a step toward reclaiming my life. Still, as I signed those final papers, I felt a hollow ache, a reminder of the love we'd once shared. There was no satisfaction in seeing it end this way, only a quiet understanding that this was what we needed. I walked out of that office feeling both free and strangely lost, uncertain of where this new path would lead. All I knew was that I couldn't go back, not now, not ever. And as painful as it was, a part of me knew that this ending held the possibility of a new beginning. If only I had the courage to embrace it. After the divorce, the weight of everything hit Lucy hard. I could see the toll it took on her, even from a distance. She seemed lost, like a shadow of the person I'd known all those years. Our kids, too, noticed the shift, and it pained them to see their mother struggle. It was heartbreaking, seeing her this way, bearing the consequences of her choices, a reality that now felt all too heavy for her to carry alone. I never wanted this for her, but there was a certain intention behind her actions, a path she'd chosen. All I could do was watch, feeling a strange mixture of hurt and pity. Lucy began to retreat into herself, her usual energy replaced with a quiet, lingering sadness that filled any room she entered. The kids felt it too, and it changed the way they looked at her. They tried to forgive, to rebuild some semblance of normalcy, but the disappointment was evident in their eyes. Our family's trust had been broken, and the healing was slow, if it was happening at all. I knew the satisfaction of their innocent trust in us had been shattered, leaving a wound that no easy words could heal. Lucy seemed to struggle under that weight, a burden that had grown almost too heavy to bear. Conversations between Lucy and the kids became tense, hesitant. They struggled to understand, to find some way to connect with her again. I watched from afar, feeling torn, wondering if things could ever be the same. The guilt she carried was visible, and with each day that passed, it seemed to weigh on her more. Her once easy laughter was replaced by silence, her usual warmth by a distance that felt almost insurmountable. She'd made her choice, and now, it felt as though she was paying the price. It was painful to witness, even as I tried to move on. In those moments, I couldn't help but feel a sadness for what we'd lost, for the way our lives had unraveled. Lucy's struggle reminded me that actions have lasting impacts, that once you cross certain lines, you can't always find your way back. Watching her suffer was a reminder of the hurt that lingered, of the trust we'd once shared but now felt like a distant memory. Even though I knew I needed to move forward, a part of me still wondered if she'd ever find peace, and if, somehow, that would help all of us heal. After everything, I knew I had to find my own path to healing. I wasn't sure where to start, but I knew that staying in the past wasn't an option. So, I began to explore new places, traveling to cities I'd never seen, immersing myself in art and experiences that brought me a quiet kind of peace. Each journey felt like shedding an old layer, helping me to see the world and myself differently. There was satisfaction in rediscovering things that brought me joy, the simple things I hadn't allowed myself to appreciate fully. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one I never thought I'd write. With each trip, I found myself reflecting less on what had happened and more on what lay ahead. I filled my days with things that nurtured my soul: photography, painting moments of stillness by the sea. These became my therapy, my way of reconnecting with myself. Little by little, the bitterness faded, replaced by a subtle sense of purpose. I could feel myself regaining the strength I'd lost. My journey became about more than just healing from the past. It was about building a new foundation, one that didn't rely on anyone else's choices, but my own intentions for a fulfilled life. Of course, there were times when the memories would sneak back in, moments where doubt would surface. But I learned to face those feelings, to let them pass without holding on to them. For the first time in years, I felt in control, guided by my own sense of purpose. I began to find satisfaction in the freedom to choose what I wanted from life, to be my own source of happiness. It was as though I'd been given a second chance, a gift that only came through the pain of what I'd left behind. Slowly, my heart and mind felt clearer, less weighed down by regret. In the end, this journey taught me that healing isn't a straight path. It's winding and sometimes lonely, but it's also freeing in ways I hadn't imagined. My story, once defined by our marriage, now had new meaning, a story of resilience and renewal. I could finally see the future without the shadows of the past holding me back. I was learning, growing, and discovering who I was all over again. And for the first time, that felt like enough. While I was moving forward, Lucy's journey seemed to spiral in the opposite direction. I'd hear from friends or family now and then about how she was struggling, caught in a cycle of regret and self-doubt. She'd become withdrawn, barely recognizable from the vibrant person she'd once been. It was hard to know this, To think of her alone, dealing with the fallout of choices that couldn't be undone. I felt conflicted, a mix of empathy and detachment. She'd made her bed, as they say, but seeing her struggle like this wasn't something I took satisfaction in. The distance between her and the kids only grew. They couldn't quite forgive her, or maybe they just didn't know how. They'd been hit hard by the betrayal, and I could see them grappling with their own hurt and anger. Conversations were brief and stilted, full of pauses and unspoken words. She'd reached out to them, I'd heard, but each attempt seemed to fall flat. They were old enough to see the complexities of life, but that didn't make forgiving any easier. Lucy's relationship with them, once so natural, had become a painful reminder of what we'd lost as a family. As time went on, Lucy's health began to suffer too. The stress and guilt wore her down, leaving her physically exhausted, as if her choices had manifested into something she couldn't escape. She began seeing a therapist, trying to confront her mistakes, but the journey was long and uncertain. Part of me hoped she'd find peace, for her sake and the kids. After all, we'd shared a life together, and despite everything, I didn't want her to suffer endlessly. Yet I couldn't ignore that she was now living with the weight of actions that had real consequences. Consequences she hadn't fully anticipated. In moments of reflection, I'd wonder if she'd ever be able to rebuild, to find a way to make things right with the kids. I knew they still loved her, even if they couldn't express it. But the trust, the closeness, was shattered, and that wasn't something that healed easily. Watching her struggle from afar was a reminder of the importance of loyalty, of how one choice can alter everything. And as much as I wanted to leave it all behind, a part of me stayed connected, quietly hoping she'd eventually find her way back to a life she could embrace again. Reflecting on everything that had happened, I found myself revisiting the values I'd once taken for granted: trust, loyalty, honesty. These weren't just ideals. They were the foundation of a life I'd built with Lucy, the essence of what I thought kept our family strong. The betrayal had shaken that foundation, leaving behind pieces we couldn't easily put back together. In the quiet moments, I'd think about how easily one choice had unraveled so much, how an instant of lost intention could carry such weight. It was a lesson I never expected to learn this way, but one I couldn't ignore. As time passed, I came to understand the importance of being true to those values, not just in my own life, but in all relationships. What happened to us was a painful reminder that actions, even those taken in moments of weakness, have lasting impacts. Watching our family go through this change, seeing Lucy's struggles and the kids' hurt, was a stark example of what happens when those bonds are broken. In some strange way, I felt grateful for the clarity, though the satisfaction it brought came at a high cost. I'd lost a life, but I'd gained a new understanding of what truly matters. Moving forward, I wanted to carry these lessons with me, to keep them as reminders of what I valued most. Whether I found love again or chose to live independently, I knew I'd approach it differently, with a deeper respect for the things that had once been so easy to take for granted. The pain, though sharp, had softened into something almost hopeful, a belief that integrity and honesty still had a place in my life, that they could guide me towards something real. I knew I'd be more careful, more deliberate, honoring both my own intentions and those of anyone I might come to trust. In the end, I realized that life had given me a second chance, not only to rebuild, but to do so with a stronger sense of purpose. I wasn't the same person I'd been when Lucy and I first met, but I was someone with a renewed respect for what it takes to build a life grounded in true commitment. As I closed this chapter, I felt a mix of sadness and hope, a recognition that while our story had changed, I was free to write a new one. And this time, I do so with a clarity I gained through both loss and resilience.
Keep watching our stories by clicking on one of the videos that appear on the screen, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to be alerted about new videos. See you next time.